I was dragged by my hair across the cold marble floor and chained to the golden bedpost by my own husband, simply because I had dared to smile politely at the new gardener. The metal cuff snapped shut around my ankle with a heavy, final click that echoed through the silent penthouse, and the cold steel bit into my skin, reminding me instantly of my status as a prisoner in this gilded cage. Victor stood over me, his silhouette looming large against the panoramic view of the New York skyline, adjusting his diamond cufflinks with a terrifying calmness, as if he hadn't just treated his wife like a disobedient animal. My heart hammered against my ribs, threatening to bruise the inside of my chest, but I forced my breathing to slow down, knowing that any sign of panic would only excite him more. He leaned down, his cologne smelling of expensive musk and cruelty, and ran a finger down my trembling cheek, whispering that I was his property, his prized possession, and that no other man was allowed to witness the beauty that belonged solely to him. I stared at the polished tip of his Italian leather shoe, biting the inside of my lip until I tasted the metallic tang of rust, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing me cry. This was not the first time, and I knew it would not be the last. But the humiliation burned hotter today, fueled by the sheer absurdity of his jealousy. The chain was short, barely allowing me enough room to sit on the edge of the bed, effectively reducing my world to a radius of 3 feet, a physical manifestation of the suffocating control he exerted over every second of my life. I wanted to scream, to claw at his face, to wrap the golden chain around his neck and squeeze until the light faded from his obsessive eyes, but I remained frozen, paralyzed by the invisible gun he held to my head. That gun was the titanium monitor locked around my left ankle, a device that blinked with a sinister red light, mocking my helplessness. It was not merely a GPS tracker, for that would be too simple for a monster like Victor Vance. It was a dead man's switch, intricately wired to sync with his own heartbeat via a smartwatch he never took off. If his heart stopped, or if I moved more than 50 meters away from him without his biometric authorization, a signal would be instantly transmitted to a private server in the Cayman Islands. That server would then automatically send a termination order to 3 separate contract killers who were currently watching my parents' house in New Jersey and my little sister's dormitory at Yale. This was the logic that kept me docile, the terrifying equation that forced me to swallow my pride and endure his touch. I had tried to run once, 3 years ago, and the result was my brother's mysterious car accident that left him with a permanent limp. Victor had visited him in the hospital, bringing flowers and a smile, and whispered in my ear that next time it would be a funeral instead of a surgery. So I sat there, the cold gold of the chain heavy on my skin, accepting that my obedience was the only shield protecting the people I loved from being erased from existence. Victor smiled, seemingly satisfied with my silence, and turned to pour himself a glass of vintage whiskey, the liquid amber swirling in the crystal glass like the chaos in my mind. He took a slow sip, savoring the burn, and then dropped the bombshell that shattered the fragile equilibrium I had managed to maintain. He announced, in a casual tone one might use to discuss the weather, that we were moving, not to another penthouse or another city, but to his private island in the Caribbean, a remote fortress of solitude completely cut off from the rest of the world. He called it paradise, but as he described the high walls and the total lack of internet or cellular service, I knew exactly what it was. It was a tomb. He was tired of the city, tired of the prying eyes of society, and tired of sharing the air I breathed with other men. We would leave in exactly 7 days, 1 week. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Once we were on that island, surrounded by shark-infested waters and guarded by his private army, my chances of escape would drop from slim to absolute zero. The ankle monitor would no longer matter because there would be nowhere to run. I felt a cold dread seep into my marrow, realizing that this was his endgame. He intended to bury me alive, in luxury. To keep me as his exclusive doll until my beauty faded or his obsession found a new target. I looked at the calendar on the nightstand, the numbers blurring through my unshed tears. 7 days. That was the deadline. That was the ticking clock that suddenly turned my passive endurance into a desperate need for action. If I did not make my move within this week, I would never step foot on free soil again. Victor walked back to the bed, placing the empty glass on the table with a sharp clud, and told me to get dressed because we had a guest coming to discuss the security arrangements for the move. The door opened, and Kane walked in. The head of security, the man who was essentially my jailer, entered the room with the silent efficiency of a predator. He was tall, with broad shoulders that strained against his dark suit, and a face that seemed carved from granite, devoid of any readable emotion. He stopped a few feet away, his eyes scanning the room for threats before landing on me, chained to the bed like a piece of furniture. I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, perhaps surprise, perhaps disgust, but it was gone in an instant, replaced by the blank stare of a soldier following orders. Victor gestured to me with a wave of his hand, displaying my humiliation as if it were a feature of the room's decor. He told Kane that the chain was necessary because I had been acting out, painting me as a hysterical woman who needed to be restrained for her own safety. I met Kane's gaze, searching for a crack in his armor, for a hint of the man I suspected lay beneath the mercenary exterior. I knew his secret, the leverage that Victor used to own him. I knew about his mother in the specialized care facility and the exorbitant medical bills that Victor paid every month. Kane was a slave to money just as I was a slave to fear. Victor ordered Kane to inspect the window locks, treating me as if I were deaf or invisible. Kane moved past me, his presence imposing, and I smelled the faint scent of gun oil and rain on his coat. As he checked the latch, his hand brushed against the curtains, and for a split second, he paused. He didn't look at me, but the tension in his jaw was unmistakable. He was uncomfortable. Good. That discomfort was the first crack, the first tiny opening in the fortress that was Victor's security team. I needed to widen that crack, to turn this loyal dog against his master, and I had 7 days to do it. Victor laughed, a low sound that grated on my nerves, and unlocked the cuff from my ankle, throwing the chain onto the bed with a clatter. He told me to get up and serve them drinks, testing my submission in front of an audience. My ankle felt phantomly heavy, the red imprint of the metal clearly visible on my pale skin. I stood up, my legs shaky, and walked towards the bar cart, feeling the heat of both men's gazes on my back. One was filled with possessive lust, the other with cold calculation. I poured the scotch, my hands steady despite the turmoil inside, and handed the glass to Kane. Our fingers brushed, a fleeting contact that sent a jolt of electricity through the air. I looked him dead in the eye, communicating a silent plea, a challenge, and a promise, all at once. I saw his pupils dilate slightly, a physiological reaction he couldn't control. He took the glass, muttered a thank you, and stepped back, putting distance between us. Victor didn't notice the exchange, too busy admiring his own reflection in the window. He began outlining the security protocols for the island, discussing patrol routes and blind spots. I listened intently, memorizing every detail, every weakness, every code he mentioned. They thought I was just a trophy, a pretty ornament with nothing inside her head but fluff. That was their mistake. That was the blind spot that would bring them down. I was not just a victim. I was a survivor who had been studying her captor for 3 years. I knew his passwords. I knew his schedule. And most importantly, I knew that his arrogance would be his downfall. As Victor droned on about thermal cameras, I gripped the edge of the bar cart, my knuckles turning white. The meeting ended, and Victor dismissed Kane with a curt nod, treating him like the hired help he was. Kane turned to leave, but before he walked out the door, he stopped. He didn't turn around, but he hesitated for a fraction of a second, his hand hovering over the doorknob. It was a moment of indecision that spoke volumes. Then, he opened the door and vanished into the hallway. Victor turned to me, a predatory grin spreading across his face, and told me that tonight we would celebrate our upcoming departure. He reached for me, and I let him pull me into his arms, my body rigid but compliant. I rested my head on his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart. Thump, thump, thump. The sound of the trigger that held my family hostage. I closed my eyes and imagined that sound stopping. I imagined the silence that would follow. 7 days. That was all I had. I would have to turn Kane, dismantle the security system, and find a way to neutralize the threat to my family, all while playing the role of the loving, submissive wife. It was an impossible mission, a suicide run, but the alternative was a lifetime of slavery on an island in the middle of nowhere. As Victor's hand tightened around my waist, claiming his territory, I made a silent vow. I would not be getting on that plane, or if I did, Victor would not be getting off. I looked at the golden chain lying on the bed, glittering under the chandelier. It was beautiful, expensive, and strong. Just like the trap I was about to set, the game had officially begun, and I was done playing by his rules. Victor left the penthouse 20 minutes ago, leaving me alone with the man who held the keys to my cage, and the silence in the room was heavy enough to crush bone. Kane stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, his back to me, a silent statue carved from duty and indifference, watching the rain lash against the glass like bullets. I sat on the velvet sofa, my hands folded in my lap, studying the tension in his shoulders, calculating the exact angle of attack that would pierce his armor without triggering his defenses. He was not a man who could be bought with money, for Victor paid him enough to own a small country. Nor could he be seduced by flesh. As he viewed me as forbidden cargo, I had to aim lower, deeper, into the rotting wound of his own personal hell that mirrored mine. I stood up slowly, the silk of my dress rustling like a whisper in a graveyard, and walked towards the kitchen, deliberately dragging my left leg just enough to show the limp caused by the heavy monitor. Kane turned his head slightly, his earpiece blinking, tracking my movement with the precision of a hawk watching a mouse. I ignored him, reaching for a glass of water, but I let my hand tremble, splashing the liquid onto the counter. He was beside me in a second, his hand hovering near my arm but not touching, conditioned by fear of his master to keep his distance. I looked up at him, letting the mask of the perfect wife slip to reveal the exhausted prisoner beneath, and asked him softly how his mother was doing at the St. Jude facility. The question hit him like a physical blow, his eyes widening in shock, the professional mask cracking for a fraction of a second. He stepped back, his hand dropping to his tactical belt, and demanded to know how I knew about her, his voice low and dangerous. I didn't flinch. Instead, I took a step closer, invading his personal space with the truth that Victor used against him. I told him that I saw the invoices on Victor's desk, the exorbitant sums paid to keep an old woman alive on machines, the price of his soul itemized in black and white. You are just another pet on a leash. Kane, just like me. Only your chain is made of guilt while mine is made of gold. He remained silent, his jaw clenching, the muscle feathering under the skin. A sign that the seed of resentment I just planted was finding fertile ground in his heart. I turned away from him, feigning a sudden dizziness, and gripped the edge of the granite island, allowing the sleeve of my robe to slide up my arm. The bruises from yesterday's lesson were dark purple against my pale skin. A ugly map of violence that no amount of money could erase. I hissed in pain. A sharp intake of breath that was loud in the quiet room, and let the glass slip from my fingers. It shattered on the floor. The sound of breaking crystal acting as a catalyst for the tension in the room. Kane moved instinctively to stop me from stepping on the shards, his hand finally making contact with my arm to pull me back. His grip was strong, calloused, but surprisingly gentle. A stark contrast to Victor's possessive, crushing hold. I looked at his hand on my skin, then up at his eyes, trapping him in the moment. "You see what he does," I whispered, forcing him to acknowledge the brutality he usually turned a blind eye to. He tried to pull away, to retreat into his soldier persona, but I held my ground, using my own pain as a weapon to strip away his denial. He looked down at the angry red welts on my wrist where Victor had twisted my arm. And I saw the conflict raging behind his stoic gaze. Duty battled with decency. The contract fought against the conscience. And for the first time in 3 years, the human won. He didn't push me away or call for the maid to clean up the mess. Instead, he guided me to the bar stool, his movements stiff but careful, and retrieved the first aid kit from under the sink. He knelt before me, a position of submission that shifted the power dynamic in the room instantly. As he applied the antiseptic, his fingers were cool and steady, treating me not as an object to be guarded, but as a person who was bleeding. I watched the top of his head, resisting the urge to touch his hair, knowing that one wrong move would send him running back to his psychological cage. This was the first time a man had touched me in this house without the intent to own or harm. And the intimacy of the act was more dangerous than a loaded gun. I spoke to the top of his head, my voice barely a whisper, telling him that Victor was moving us to the island in 7 days. I told him that once we were there, the medical payments for his mother would become leverage, a threat that Victor would use to make him do things he couldn't live with. Kane paused, the gauze hovering over my skin, his eyes darkening as the reality of my words sank in. He knew Victor better than anyone. He knew that the monster's appetite for control was insatiable, and that, eventually, Kane would be asked to cross a line from which there was no return. I leaned forward, bringing my face close to his, and told him that there was another way. A way where his mother gets the care she needs and we both get our freedom. He finished taping the bandage, his touch lingering for a second too long before he stood up abruptly, putting distance between us like a physical barrier. He didn't say yes. He didn't agree to betray his boss. But he didn't report me either. The elevator chimed, signaling Victor's return, and the atmosphere in the room snapped back to cold terror. Kane stepped back into the shadows, his face a mask of stone, just as the doors slid open to reveal my husband. Victor walked in, his eyes scanning the room, landing immediately on the broken glass and the bandage on my arm. He demanded to know what happened, his voice laced with suspicion, his gaze darting between me and his head of security. My heart stopped, waiting for the accusation, waiting for Kane to tell him that I had been talking about his mother, about money, about escape. But Kane spoke first, his voice steady and devoid of emotion. He lied. He told Victor that I had fainted from the heat and cut myself, and that he had simply applied a patch. Victor looked at Kane, searching for a lie, then looked at me with a sneer of disgust at my weakness. He didn't know that in that small, insignificant lie, His empire had just begun to crumble. Kane had chosen a side, and for now, it was mine. Victor left the penthouse 20 minutes ago, leaving me alone with the man who held the keys to my cage. And the silence in the room was heavy enough to crush bone. Kane stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, his back to me. A silent statue carved from duty and indifference, watching the rain lash against the glass like bullets. I sat on the velvet sofa, my hands folded in my lap, studying the tension in his shoulders, calculating the exact angle of attack that would pierce his armor without triggering his defenses. He was not a man who could be bought with money, for Victor paid him enough to own a small country. Nor could he be seduced by flesh. As he viewed me as forbidden cargo, I had to aim lower, deeper, into the rotting wound of his own personal hell that mirrored mine. I stood up slowly, the silk of my dress rustling like a whisper in a graveyard, and walked towards the kitchen, deliberately dragging my left leg just enough to show the limp caused by the heavy monitor. Kane turned his head slightly, his earpiece blinking, tracking my movement with the precision of a hawk watching a mouse. I ignored him, reaching for a glass of water, but I let my hand tremble, splashing the liquid onto the counter. He was beside me in a second, his hand hovering near my arm but not touching. Conditioned by fear of his master to keep his distance, I looked up at him, letting the mask of the perfect wife slip to reveal the exhausted prisoner beneath, and asked him softly how his mother was doing at the St. Jude facility. The question hit him like a physical blow, his eyes widening in shock, the professional mask cracking for a fraction of a second. He stepped back, his hand dropping to his tactical belt, and demanded to know how I knew about her, his voice low and dangerous. I didn't flinch. Instead, I took a step closer, invading his personal space with the truth that Victor used against him. I told him that I saw the invoices on Victor's desk, the exorbitant sums paid to keep an old woman alive on machines, the price of his soul itemized in black and white. You are just another pet on a leash, Kane, just like me. Only your chain is made of guilt while mine is made of gold. He remained silent, his jaw clenching, the muscle feathering under the skin, a sign that the seed of resentment I just planted was finding fertile ground in his heart. I turned away from him, feigning a sudden dizziness, and gripped the edge of the granite island, allowing the sleeve of my robe to slide up my arm. The bruises from yesterday's lesson were dark purple against my pale skin, a ugly map of violence that no amount of money could erase. I hissed in pain, a sharp intake of breath that was loud in the quiet room, and let the glass slip from my fingers. It shattered on the floor, the sound of breaking crystal acting as a catalyst for the tension in the room. Kane moved instinctively to stop me from stepping on the shards, his hand finally making contact with my arm to pull me back. His grip was strong, calloused, but surprisingly gentle, a stark contrast to Victor's possessive, crushing hold. I looked at his hand on my skin, then up at his eyes, trapping him in the moment. You see what he does, I whispered, forcing him to acknowledge the brutality he usually turned a blind eye to. He tried to pull away, to retreat into his soldier persona, but I held my ground, using my own pain as a weapon to strip away his denial. He looked down at the angry red welts on my wrist where Victor had twisted my arm, and I saw the conflict raging behind his stoic gaze. Duty battled with decency, the contract fought against the conscience, and for the first time in 3 years, the human won. He didn't push me away or call for the maid to clean up the mess. Instead, he guided me to the bar stool, his movements stiff but careful, and retrieved the first aid kit from under the sink. He knelt before me, a position of submission that shifted the power dynamic in the room instantly. as he applied the antiseptic. His fingers were cool and steady, treating me not as an object to be guarded, but as a person who was bleeding. I watched the top of his head, resisting the urge to touch his hair, knowing that one wrong move would send him running back to his psychological cage. This was the first time a man had touched me in this house without the intent to own or harm, and the intimacy of the act was more dangerous than a loaded gun. I spoke to the top of his head, my voice barely a whisper, telling him that Victor was moving us to the island in 7 days. I told him that once we were there, the medical payments for his mother would become leverage, a threat that Victor would use to make him do things he couldn't live with. Kane paused, the gauze hovering over my skin, his eyes darkening as the reality of my words sank in. He knew Victor better than anyone. He knew that the monster's appetite for control was insatiable, and that eventually, Kane would be asked to cross a line from which there was no return. I leaned forward, bringing my face close to his, and told him that there was another way. A way where his mother gets the care she needs and we both get our freedom. He finished taping the bandage, his touch lingering for a second too long, before he stood up abruptly, putting distance between us like a physical barrier. He didn't say yes. He didn't agree to betray his boss, but he didn't report me either. The elevator chimed, signaling Victor's return, and the atmosphere in the room snapped back to cold terror. Kane stepped back into the shadows, his face a mask of stone. Just as the doors slid open to reveal my husband, Victor walked in, his eyes scanning the room, landing immediately on the broken glass and the bandage on my arm. He demanded to know what happened, his voice laced with suspicion, his gaze darting between me and his head of security. My heart stopped, waiting for the accusation, waiting for Kane to tell him that I had been talking about his mother, about money, about escape. But Kane spoke first, his voice steady and devoid of emotion. He lied. He told Victor that I had fainted from the heat and cut myself, and that he had simply applied a patch. Victor looked at Kane, searching for a lie, then looked at me with a sneer of disgust at my weakness. He didn't know that in that small, insignificant lie, his empire had just begun to crumble. Kane had chosen a side, and for now, it was mine. The makeup artist applied a third layer of heavy concealer to the purple shadows under my eyes, her hand trembling slightly as Victor watched from the doorway like a hawk perched on a branch. I sat perfectly still in the velvet chair, staring at my reflection in the gilded mirror, recognizing the hollowed cheeks and the dead look in my eyes that belonged to a corpse rather than a hostess. My body still ached with a deep, bone-chilling cold from the wine cellar incident yesterday, a phantom frost that no amount of central heating could chase away. But tonight I had to shine. Victor stepped into the room, his tuxedo sharp and expensive, and dismissed the makeup artist with a careless wave of his hand, treating her as if she were invisible. He walked up behind me, placing his hands on my shoulders, his fingers digging into the tender flesh where the cold had bitten the deepest, and whispered that I looked beautiful, like a porcelain doll that had been put back together. He adjusted the diamond choker around my neck, the stones cold and heavy against my skin, and told me that tonight was important, that investors needed to see a happy, thriving couple before we disappeared to our private paradise. I forced a smile onto my lips, a mechanical grimace that didn't reach my eyes, and stood up. The floor-length emerald gown swishing around my legs, hiding the faint tremors that still plagued my muscles. This was the theater of the elite, a performance where a single slip in character could result in a punishment far worse than a night in a freezer. And I was the lead actress in a tragedy written by a madman. The penthouse was transformed into a glittering ballroom, filled with the elite of New York society. men in bespoke suits, and women dripping in jewels, all drinking vintage champagne and laughing over the sound of a string quartet. I circulated through the room on Victor's arm, a silent accessory to his power, nodding politely as men discussed mergers and acquisitions that would destroy thousands of jobs. The air smelled of expensive perfume and moral decay, a suffocating mixture that made my head spin, but I kept my spine straight. Playing the role of the devoted wife, Kane was positioned near the balcony doors, a shadow in the corner, his eyes scanning the crowd with professional detachment. But every time his gaze flickered to me, I saw the raw, bleeding guilt behind the stoic mask. He had given me his word. He was in. But tonight Victor would test that loyalty one last time, pushing him to the brink of his humanity to see if he would break. A man named Mr. Sterling, a heavy-set investor with a flushed face and eyes that roamed over me like I was a menu item, stumbled towards us, the smell of bourbon preceding him by 3 feet. He laughed too loudly at Victor's joke, his hand reaching out to grab my waist, his sweaty fingers squeezing my side with a familiarity that made bile rise in my throat. Victor didn't defend me. He didn't step in to protect his wife's honor. Instead, he froze, his smile vanishing instantly, replaced by the cold, dead stare of a reptile whose territory had been breached. Victor didn't say a word to Sterling. He simply lifted his chin and made a subtle motion with 2 fingers, a signal that cut through the noise of the party like a gunshot. Kane moved instantly, crossing the room with terrifying speed, his presence parting the crowd like the Red Sea as people instinctively stepped back from the aura of violence he projected. He grabbed Sterling by the back of the collar, not like a security guard escorting a guest, but like a butcher handling meat, and dragged him away from me with a force that sent a champagne glass crashing to the floor. The music stopped, the laughter died, and the room fell into a stunned silence as Kane forced the struggling man towards the terrace doors, his face a mask of stone that betrayed nothing of the turmoil I knew was raging inside him. Victor took a sip of his wine, the crystal clinking against his teeth, and told the room to continue, that it was just a minor pest control issue, normalizing the brutality with a terrifying casualness. Out on the terrace, obscured by the heavy curtains but visible enough for the imagination to fill in the blanks, the sound of a heavy impact echoed, a sickening thud of flesh hitting stone that made several guests flinch. I watched Kane's silhouette, watching the rise and fall of his arm, and I knew that every blow he landed on that drunk fool was a blow to his own soul, a piece of his humanity being chipped away by Victor's command. 10 minutes later, I found Kane in the service kitchen, washing his hands in the deep steel sink, the water running red with blood that wasn't his own. He was scrubbing his knuckles with a frantic intensity, as if he could wash away the sin of what he had just done, his breathing ragged and harsh in the quiet room. I stepped out of the shadows, the emerald dress pooling around my feet, and stood beside him, watching the pink water swirl down the drain. He didn't look up. He couldn't look up, shame radiating from him in waves so strong they were almost palpable. I reached out and turned off the faucet, the sudden silence ringing in our ears, and forced him to look at me, to look at the woman whose husband had turned him into a monster. I told him that Victor didn't order that beating because Sterling touched me, but because he wanted to remind you who owns your hands, who owns your violence, and who owns your mother's life. Kane gripped the edge of the sink, his knuckles white, and looked at me with eyes that were hollowed out by self-loathing. I leaned in close, whispering that tonight was the last time he would ever have to be a dog for that man, that the plan we had was the only way to wash his hands clean for good. He nodded, a single, sharp movement, and I saw the resolve harden in his eyes, replacing the shame with a cold, deadly purpose, The beast had been unleashed, but this time, it was aiming for the master's throat. 5 days remained on the countdown until my permanent exile to the island, and the silence in the penthouse was thick enough to choke on. I stood in the center of the master bathroom, the steam from the jacuzzi rising around me like a white shroud, and looked at the bottle of sleeping pills in my hand. They were merely high-strength vitamins I had swapped into the prescription bottle hours ago. But to Victor, they would look like a desperate exit strategy, a final act of defiance from a broken doll. I poured the entire bottle into the toilet and flushed them away, listening to the water swirl, then scattered a few white chalk tablets on the marble floor to stage the scene. This was the gamble, the high-stakes poker game where I had to bet my life to win the pot. Because I needed Victor distracted, terrified, and most importantly, I needed his hands off his phone. I slipped into the warm water, fully clothed in a white silk nightgown that clung to my skin like a second layer of flesh, and let my head loll back against the porcelain rim. I slowed my breathing, using the yoga techniques I had practiced for years to lower my heart rate, and waited for the inevitable check-in that Victor performed every hour on the hour. The plan relied entirely on his obsession, on the fact that he valued his possession more than his security protocols. And if I was wrong, if he chose caution over panic, then Kane and I were both dead. The door handle rattled, followed by a sharp knock that echoed in the tiled room, and then Victor's voice called my name, impatient and commanding. I didn't answer, letting my eyes flutter shut, my body going limp in the water as I held my breath until my lungs burned. The electronic lock beeped, bypassed by his master code, and the heavy door swung open, hitting the stopper with a dull thud. I heard his footsteps, confident and heavy, turn into a frantic scramble as he saw me floating there, the empty pill bottle lying accusingly on the bath mat. He shouted my name, a raw sound of terror that I had never heard from him before, and splashed into the water, ruining his Italian suit without a second thought. He pulled me up, his hands shaking violently as he slapped my cheek, his fingers wet and frantic, desperate to find a pulse in my neck. I kept my body dead weight, forcing him to take the full burden of my unconscious form, creating the chaos necessary for the shadow to move. Victor yelled for Kane, his voice cracking, ordering him to get the medical kit and call the private doctor. His usual composure shattered into 1,000 pieces by the prospect of losing his favorite toy. Kane appeared in the doorway instantly, as if he had been waiting for the cue, his face a mask of professional concern that hid the calculating thief beneath. He rushed to the side of the tub, dropping to his knees beside Victor, and I felt the water shift as he leaned in, ostensibly to check my pupils. Victor was babbling, checking my airway, his hands occupied with holding my head above the water, his focus entirely narrowed down to my pale face. His phone, the digital fortress that held the codes to the security system and the live feed of my parents' house, was protruding from his wet jacket pocket, vulnerable and exposed. Kane reached out, his hand moving with the speed of a magician, and pulled the device free, sliding it under the pretext of checking Victor's pocket for an EpiPen or a stimulant. Victor didn't notice. His eyes were wild, pleading with me to wake up, promising me anything if I would just breathe. Kane angled the phone towards Victor's face for a split second, using the frantic movement of checking my pulse to align the facial recognition camera with Victor's panicked stare. The phone unlocked silently, a small vibration that only Kane felt, and, in that microsecond, the fortress was breached. Kane tapped the screen rapidly, his fingers flying across the glass as he transferred the admin rights to a ghost server we had set up, executing a script that would loop the camera feeds at my parents' house. It took 10 seconds. 10 agonizing seconds where I had to play dead while Victor shook me, his tears dripping onto my face, hot and salty. He was crying, actually crying, proving that his sickness was indeed a form of love. However twisted and poisonous it might be, Kane slipped the phone back into Victor's pocket just as I let out a ragged, gasping cough, expelling the air from my lungs in a dramatic return to the living. Victor pulled me into a crushing hug, burying his face in my wet hair, sobbing that he was sorry, that he would fix everything, that he would never let me be sad again. Over his trembling shoulder, I met Kane's eyes. He gave a microscopic nod, a signal that the deed was done. The tracking software on my family was now blind, looping a pre-recorded video of a peaceful night. While the real targets were being moved by Kane's contacts, we had the keys to the kingdom, and the devil didn't even know he had been robbed. Victor was pacing the length of the master bedroom like a caged tiger, his eyes bloodshot and manic from a sleepless night spent watching my chest rise and fall. The morning sun was just beginning to bleed through the heavy velvet curtains, painting the room in a sickly gray light that matched the dread pooling in my stomach. He stopped abruptly at the foot of the bed, gripping the mahogany post with white-knuckled intensity, and announced that we were leaving for the island immediately. My heart hammered against my ribs, skipping a beat as the timeline I had carefully constructed shattered into 1,000 useless pieces. I tried to protest, keeping my voice weak and raspy to maintain the charade of a recovering suicide victim, but he cut me off with a sharp gesture. He declared that the city was poisoning me, that the noise and the pressure were driving me to self-destruction, and that only total isolation could cure my fragile mind. He grabbed his phone, the very device Kane had compromised only hours ago, and began barking orders to the pilot to prep the jet for a departure in 60 minutes. I looked at the digital clock on the nightstand, watching the numbers shift, realizing that Kane and I had lost our window of opportunity. The rescue team for my family needed another 4 hours to secure the targets. And if we left now, the signal loop would eventually be discovered, and my parents would be executed before I even landed on the tarmac. I sat up slowly, swinging my legs over the edge of the bed, and tried to stall him by asking for breakfast, hoping to buy even a few precious minutes for Kane to react. Victor ignored me, his attention shifting to the wall of monitors hidden behind a sliding panel, his obsession with control overriding his concern for my hunger. He tapped the screen, bringing up the live feed of my parents' house in New Jersey, needing the dopamine hit of seeing them vulnerable and unaware. The image on the screen showed a peaceful suburban street, the wind gently rustling the leaves of the oak tree in the front yard, exactly as it had been recorded last night. Victor stared at the screen, his head tilting to the side like a curious bird, a frown deepening the lines on his forehead. He muttered that something was wrong, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that sent a shiver down my spine. He pointed a trembling finger at the corner of the screen, where a neighbor's cat was sitting on the fence, frozen in mid-lick. The loop was perfect, except for that one tiny, insignificant detail that only a paranoid madman would notice. The time stamp in the bottom right corner was ticking forward, but the world inside the frame was trapped in a digital purgatory. Victor turned to me, his eyes wide with a terrifying realization, the mask of the loving husband dissolving to reveal the monster beneath. He pulled the gun from the holster at the small of his back, the metal gleaming dull and cold in the morning light, and aimed it directly at the center of my forehead. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the sound of the safety clicking off, a sound that echoed like a thunderclap in the confined space. He didn't ask how I did it. He didn't ask for an explanation. He simply demanded to know who helped me, his voice shaking with a mixture of rage and betrayal. He knew I didn't have the technical skills to loop a security feed. He knew someone had breached his fortress from the inside. I remained silent, my eyes locked on the barrel of the gun, knowing that any answer I gave would result in a bullet. Victor laughed, a high-pitched sound that bordered on hysteria, and grabbed the remote, switching the feed to the interior camera of my parents' living room. It showed my mother reading a book, the same page she had been reading for 12 hours. He screamed that I thought I was clever, that I thought I could outsmart him with a cheap trick. But I had forgotten that he had a failsafe. He pulled out a second phone, a burner he kept for emergencies, and dialed a number, his eyes never leaving mine. I knew that number connected directly to the hitman on the ground, a direct line that bypassed the digital system we had hacked. Kane burst into the room, his weapon drawn. Having heard the shouting and the unmistakable click of a firearm, Victor didn't even look at him, keeping the gun trained on me, and ordered Kane to shoot me in the leg. He wanted to punish me, to break my body as a lesson for my mind, and he wanted his loyal dog to do the dirty work. He screamed at Kane to do it, to prove that he wasn't part of this conspiracy, his finger tightening on the trigger of his own weapon. I looked at Kane, seeing the agony in his eyes, the split-second decision that would define the rest of his life. Victor yelled into the burner phone, commanding the hitman to enter the house and execute the first person he saw, his voice cracking with desperation. But the phone remained silent, dead air hissing in his ear. Because Kane had jammed the cellular signal in the penthouse the moment he realized the plan was compromised, Victor looked at the phone, then at Kane, and the realization hit him like a physical blow. The betrayal wasn't just a technical glitch. It was standing right in front of him, wearing the uniform of his own security team. Victor turned the gun from me to Kane, his face twisting into a mask of pure hatred, and squeezed the trigger. The shot went wide, burying itself in the plaster of the wall. As Kane lunged forward, tackling Victor to the ground with the force of a freight train, they crashed into the antique vanity, sending bottles of perfume and shards of mirror flying across the room. A chaotic explosion of glass and violence. I scrambled off the bed, grabbing the heavy brass lamp from the nightstand, my hands shaking but my resolve iron hard. Kane was strong, but Victor was fighting with the manic strength of a man who was losing his entire world. The gun skittered across the floor, spinning away from them, and both men scrambled for it, a deadly race where second place meant a coffin. Kane landed a heavy blow to Victor's ribs, a sickening crunch echoing in the room. But Victor managed to gouge his thumb into Kane's eye, forcing him to recoil with a grunt of pain. Victor scrambled toward the gun, his fingers inches from the cold steel, and I knew that if he picked it up, there would be no second chances. I lifted the lamp high above my head, the brass heavy and cold in my hands, and brought it down with all the force of my 3 years of hatred. The heavy brass base of the lamp connected with Victor's skull, producing a sickening crack that vibrated up my arms, but instead of collapsing into unconsciousness, he roared like a wounded animal. Blood streamed down his face, blinding him in one eye, yet he lunged at Kane with a feral intensity that defied physics. Kane, partially blinded by Victor's earlier gouge and disoriented from the concussion, couldn't deflect the tackle, and they crashed into the floor-to-ceiling window, the glass spiderwebbing under the force of their impact. I scrambled across the carpet, my knees burning as I reached for the gun, my fingers brushing the cold steel just as a shadow fell over me. Victor had abandoned Kane, realizing the true threat was the weapon in my hand, and kicked me hard in the ribs. The air left my lungs in a painful whoosh, and I rolled away, gasping for breath, watching as he stomped on the gun, sliding it under the heavy oak dresser. He turned back to Kane, lifting him by the throat and slamming him against the wall, his bloody face twisted into a mask of pure demonic rage. Cain struggled, his face turning a mottled purple, his hands clawing uselessly at Victor's iron grip. But the loss of blood was taking its toll on his strength. I pushed myself up, ignoring the screaming pain in my side, and grabbed a long shard of mirror from the ruined vanity, the edges razor-sharp against my palm. I rushed at Victor, pressing the jagged glass against his carotid artery, screaming at him to let go or I would slice his throat open right there. Victor froze, his chest heaving, and slowly released Cain, who slid to the floor coughing and gasping for air. Victor didn't look afraid. Instead, a terrifyingly calm smile spread across his bloodied lips as he tapped the smartwatch on his left wrist. He whispered that I should go ahead and cut, that I should sever the artery and watch him bleed out on the Persian rug. But he warned me that this watch was not just a monitor. It was a deadman switch linked to a server that Cain hadn't found, if his heart rate dropped to 0. A signal would bypass the jammer via a satellite uplink, sending a command to detonate the gas lines in my parents' basement in New Jersey. The logic of his cruelty was impeccable, a fail-safe built on his own mortality, ensuring that if he died, he would take everyone I loved with him into the grave. The glass shook in my hand, nicking his skin, drawing a single bead of blood that rolled down his neck. But I couldn't drive it home. I backed away, my legs trembling, and retrieved the gun from under the dresser, aiming it at his chest. My finger heavy on the trigger. Victor laughed, wiping the blood from his eyes, and took a step toward me, challenging me to shoot. He taunted me, saying that pulling that trigger was the same as pulling the pin on a grenade in my mother's lap. He knew I didn't have the stomach for collateral damage. He knew I was weak. And he used that morality as a shield to walk right up to the barrel of the gun. Cain groaned from the floor, trying to rise, warning me not to listen. But the risk was too high. The mathematical probability of his threat being real was 100%. Victor stopped inches from the gun, his chest pressing against the muzzle, and told me to put it down, his voice dropping to a hypnotic command. He reached out to take the weapon, his arrogance returning in full force, believing that he had once again outmaneuvered us with his superior planning. But he had forgotten one variable in his equation. He had forgotten that a dead man's switch required a stopped heart, not a functioning brain. I looked at the watch, the green line pulsating with his adrenaline, and then I looked at Cain, who was subtly reaching for a heavy bronze statue on the floor. I didn't lower the gun. Instead, I shifted my aim downwards, targeting the one place that would incapacitate him without stopping his heart. I whispered that I didn't need to kill him to stop him. I just needed to make him wish he was dead. I pulled the trigger, the explosion deafening in the small room, and the bullet shattered his kneecap, sending him crashing to the floor in a scream of agony that was music to my ears. His heart rate spiked on the monitor, faster and wilder. But it didn't stop. He was alive. He was in pain. And he was ours. Victor lay writhing on the Persian rug, clutching his ruined knee with hands that were slick with his own sweat. Yet the laughter bubbling from his throat was the sound of a man who still held all the cards. I stood over him, the barrel of the gun smoking slightly in the cool air-conditioned room, my chest heaving with the adrenaline of having pulled the trigger. Cain was already kneeling beside him, pulling a roll of duct tape from his tactical belt to bind Victor's wrists. His movements efficient despite the blood dripping from his injured eye. Victor hissed through his teeth, the pain clearly agonizing. But his eyes locked onto mine with a terrifying clarity. He told me that shooting him was a mistake, a calculation error that would cost me everything I was trying to save. He raised his left wrist, shaking the expensive platinum watch that pulsed with a steady green light. and revealed the second layer of his trap. The device was not just a heart rate monitor, but a sophisticated GPS tracker with a fail-safe timer built into its core. If the watch remained stationary for more than 60 minutes, the system would assume he had been captured or incapacitated. The result would be the same as if his heart had stopped. The signal would go out, and the gas lines in my parents' house would turn into an inferno. I looked at the digital face of the watch, seeing the timer counting down from 59 minutes. We had trapped ourselves in a new nightmare. We couldn't leave him here to rot, and we couldn't stay. We had to move him. We had to become the kidnappers of our own tormentor. We dragged Victor out of the penthouse, his body heavy and uncooperative, leaving a trail of chaos through the pristine hallway he had designed to intimidate guests. I took his shoulders, while Kane took his good leg, ignoring his curses and the threats he spat at us with every jolt of movement. The elevator ride down to the private garage felt like an eternity, the numbers on the display changing with agonizing slowness while Victor kept reminding us of the time. 45 minutes. That was all we had left to trick the satellite into thinking he was still mobile, still in control. We shoved him into the back seat of his own armored SUV, the black leather squeaking as he struggled against the restraints. I jumped into the driver's seat, my hands trembling as I gripped the leather steering wheel, while Kane slid into the passenger side, opening his laptop and connecting a hard-line cable to the diagnostic port of the car. He shouted at me to drive, to keep the vehicle moving above 30 miles per hour to satisfy the GPS displacement algorithm. I slammed my foot on the accelerator, the engine roaring to life like a waking beast, and we shot out of the garage, the tires screeching against the concrete as we merged into the morning traffic of New York City. The rain had started to fall, turning the city streets into a blur of gray and neon, mimicking the static in my mind. I wove through the congestion, running red lights and ignoring the honking horns of angry commuters, my focus entirely on the rearview mirror where Victor sat. He was leaning forward as much as his bonds allowed, his face pale from shock, but his grin still intact. He taunted Kane, asking if he thought he could hack military-grade encryption with a stolen laptop and a prayer. He told us that the watch used a rolling code, a sequence that changed every 10 seconds, and that one wrong entry would trigger the detonation instantly. Kane ignored him, his fingers flying across the keyboard. His good eye narrowed in intense concentration as lines of code cascaded down his screen. He was trying to build a digital bridge, a signal spoofer that would mimic the electrical impulse of Victor's heartbeat and feed it back into the watch's sensor loop. It was a delicate operation, like performing open-heart surgery in a car moving at 80 miles per hour. I swerved to avoid a taxi, the sudden motion causing Victor to slam against the door. And he let out a sharp cry of pain. I felt a surge of grim satisfaction. He was just a package now, a dangerous, volatile package that I had to deliver to safety before I could dispose of it. 20 minutes. The voice from the back seat was weaker now, the pain of his shattered knee finally piercing through his arrogance, but the threat remained lethal. Kane cursed under his breath, sweat beading on his forehead as he hit a firewall in the watch's operating system. He told me he needed a stable connection, that the car's vibrations were causing packet loss in the data transfer. I scanned the road ahead, looking for a stretch of highway where I could maintain speed without swerving. We hit the expressway, the open road stretching out before us, and I floored the pedal, pushing the heavy SUV to 100 miles per hour. Victor laughed, a dry, rasping sound, and said it didn't matter how fast we drove. We couldn't outrun the signal. He offered us a deal. If I turned the car around and drove him to the hospital, he would deactivate the timer. He promised he wouldn't kill my parents. He would only punish me. It was a lie, a desperate attempt to regain control. But for a second, the temptation to surrender whispered in my ear, Then I looked at Kane. He wasn't giving up. He pulled a wire from his bag, stripped the insulation with his teeth, and turned around. Reaching into the back seat, he told Victor to shut up, his voice cold and hard, and clamped the wire directly onto the metal casing of the watch. Kane turned back to his screen, his fingers moving with renewed urgency. He explained that he couldn't crack the code, so he was going to overload the sensor with a feedback loop. He was going to make the watch think Victor's heart was beating so perfectly, so rhythmically, that it would enter a diagnostic mode. In diagnostic mode, the fail-safe triggers were temporarily suspended for maintenance. It was a backdoor feature the manufacturer had installed for servicing, a flaw that Victor's arrogance had likely overlooked. 10 minutes. The timer on the watch was blinking red now, a visual countdown to my family's execution. Victor realized what Kane was doing. He started thrashing in the back seat, using his head to batter the window, trying to create enough interference to break the connection. I shouted at him to stop, swerving the car violently to throw him off balance. He fell back against the seat, groaning. But the cable held. Kane shouted that he had a lock. He typed a final command and hit enter with a force that threatened to crack the key. For a moment, nothing happened. The rain drummed on the roof. The engine hummed, and the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, a soft chime echoed from the back seat. The green light on the watch stopped pulsing. It turned a solid, steady blue. The diagnostic mode was active. The dead man switch was asleep. Victor stared at his wrist, his eyes wide with disbelief, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The leverage that had held me captive for 3 years, the invisible gun pointed at my parents' heads, had just been unloaded. Kane didn't hesitate. He reached back with a pair of heavy-duty wire cutters he had taken from the garage. He didn't ask for permission, and he didn't offer a warning. With a single, powerful squeeze of his hand, he sheared through the platinum band of the watch. The metal snapped with a sharp ping. Kane yanked the device off Victor's wrist and threw it onto the passenger seat. It sat there, an innocuous piece of metal and glass, no longer a weapon of mass destruction. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw Victor Vance for what he truly was, a man with a broken leg, tied up in the back of a car, with absolutely nothing left to bargain with. The monster had been declawed, and now, we were going to decide his fate. I pushed the heavy armored SUV to a screeching halt directly in front of the federal building, the tires mounting the curb in a final act of reckless defiance against the traffic laws. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets of Manhattan glistening like a dark mirror, reflecting the red and blue strobe lights that were already pulsing against the gray stone facade of the headquarters. Victor shifted in the back seat, his face pale and slick with sweat, his eyes darting from the swarm of heavily armed agents on the steps to the back of my head. He let out a dry, incredulous laugh, the sound of a man whose brain could not comprehend the concept of consequences. He leaned forward, straining against the silver duct tape binding his wrists, and hissed that I was a naive fool for bringing him here. He told me that this was just a building, that the men inside were just government employees waiting to be bought, and that his legal team would have him out on bail before I could even finish signing a witness statement. He offered me $50 million to drive away right now, treating my freedom like a commodity he could haggle over in a boardroom. I turned off the ignition, the sudden silence in the car ringing louder than the sirens outside, and looked at him in the rearview mirror one last time. He was no longer the terrifying monster who haunted my nightmares. He was just a pathetic man with a shattered knee and a checkbook that was about to bounce. I unbuckled my seatbelt and turned around, resting my arm on the back of the seat. Looking at him with a pity that cut deeper than any knife, I told him that he was right about one thing, that money usually talks in this city, but he was operating on outdated information. I nodded to Kane, who turned his laptop screen around to face the back seat so Victor could see the display. It wasn't showing a bank transfer or a negotiation protocol. It was showing a live feed of the national news network. The headline scrolling across the bottom of the screen read in bold red letters, "Tech mogul Victor Vance wanted for domestic terrorism and conspiracy to commit murder." Kane spoke for the first time in an hour, his voice calm and deeply satisfied. He explained that, while I was driving, he hadn't just disabled the watch. He had dumped the entire contents of Victor's private server onto the dark web and simultaneously emailed every major news outlet and federal agency in the country. The contracts for the hitmen, the blueprints of the gas lines at my parents' house, the video files of him holding me hostage, it was all public domain now. Victor stared at the screen, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly, the color draining from his face, until he looked like a ghost. I whispered that he couldn't buy a judge when the whole world was watching the evidence on their smartphones. I hadn't just called the police. I had summoned the executioners of his legacy. The doors of the SUV were ripped open by agents wearing yellow FBI windbreakers, their weapons drawn and trained on the man who thought he was untouchable. They didn't treat him like a billionaire or a VIP. They dragged him out by the collar of his ruined Italian suit jacket like a common criminal, ignoring his screams about his injured leg and his constitutional rights. I watched from the driver's seat as they threw him onto the wet pavement, pressing his face into the dirty water that had pooled in the gutter. He shrieked my name, a desperate and animalistic sound, begging me to tell them it was a mistake, begging me to come back to him because he loved me. But his voice was drowned out by the agent reading him his Miranda rights, a robotic litany that signaled the end of his reign. He looked up at me as they hauled him to his feet, his eyes wide with the realization that the cage he had built for me was now the cell he would rot in for the rest of his life. I didn't smile. I didn't frown. I just watched him disappear into the back of a squad car, a small and broken figure sandwiched between two large officers. The tinted window rolled up, severing the connection between us forever. The golden cage was finally empty. I stepped out of the car, my legs feeling strangely light, as if gravity had loosened its crushing grip on my shoulders. The air smelled of rain and exhaust fumes, but to me, it smelled like oxygen, pure, unfiltered oxygen. Kane was standing by the hood of the car, wiping the hard drive of his laptop with a powerful industrial magnet, destroying the last digital breadcrumbs that could link us to the illegal hack. He looked at me, his good eye crinkling at the corner, and gave me a curt, respectful nod. There were no grand declarations of love, no dramatic kisses in the rain. We were soldiers who had survived a war, and the silence between us was a bond stronger than any romance. He pointed to a black sedan waiting down the street, where I knew my parents and sister were sitting, safe and waiting to take me home. I walked towards them, my bare feet cold on the pavement, leaving the SUV, the penthouse, and the name Mrs. Vance behind me in the rearview mirror of my life. I didn't look back at Kane. I didn't need to. I knew he would be watching my back until I disappeared around the corner. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs until they ached, and for the first time in 3 years, I didn't have to ask for permission to exhale.